Story 1. Saw someone staring at me through the window. It started with the sound of gravel popping under slow tires. My house sits off a forgotten stretch of highway outside of Amarillo. Nothing but dried grass, sagging barbed wire, and telephone poles leaning like tired old men. Nights out here are the kind of black that swallows the horizon. The nearest neighbor is a mile down. And when you live this far out, you notice every set of headlights, every crunch of tires. That night, I was sitting in the living room with the lamp on, half watching a rerun of some sitcom, half dozing with a beer sweating in my hand. I heard the tires outside, moving real slow, then stopping altogether. At first, I figured someone had broken down. It happens. The highway eats cars alive. But then the silence stretched on. No doors opening, no footsteps, no voices. Just the sound of my old refrigerator humming and the faint squeak of crickets outside. I stood up, pulled the curtain back, and looked. Nothing but my own reflection staring back at me in the glass. The road out there was dark, empty. No car, no lights. I told myself I'd imagined it. Too much beer, maybe. But then came the tapping. It was soft, almost polite. 3 quick taps against the window behind me, the one in the kitchen. I froze, my skin crawling, every hair on my arm standing at attention. It wasn't the kind of sound the wind makes. Not branches either. This was a deliberate sound. Knuckles or fingernails on glass. I turned slowly, heart hammering, and saw a face. Just beyond the thin pane of the kitchen window. A pale, narrow face was pressed close. The features weren't clear. The lamp in the living room threw more reflection than light. But the eyes, I saw those. Wide open, unblinking, dark as tar. And they were looking straight at me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. By the time I grabbed the flashlight and shone it at the window, the face was gone. Nothing there but the faint outline of condensation, like someone had leaned their mouth and nose against the glass. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in the recliner with the shotgun across my lap, listening for every creak of the house, every whistle of wind. Nothing else happened until dawn, when I finally dozed off from sheer exhaustion. But the next night it happened again. This time I'd been ready. Curtains drawn, doors locked, shotgun oiled, and close at hand. Around midnight, just as the coyotes started yipping in the distance, I heard it, that same gravel crunch outside. I held my breath, waited. Then came the scrape, a dragging sound, slow, like a shoe scuffing across cement. It circled the house. I crept toward the back door, careful not to make the old boards groan under me. My hands were shaking so hard the barrel of the gun tapped against the doorframe. Then I heard it, clear as day, breathing. Someone was standing just on the other side of the door, sucking in air like they'd run a mile. Heavy, ragged, wet. I yanked the door open. Flashlight beams slicing the darkness. Nothing. Just the empty backyard. The rusted swing set swaying gently in the wind. That was worse than seeing something, because it meant whoever it was, whatever it was faster than me. Slippery. Playing a game. By the third night, I'd convinced myself it was just some local kid screwing with me. This stretch of road had a reputation. Old man living alone. Creepy house. Easy target. That explanation helped me get through the daylight hours. But when the sun went down, the fear came crawling back. That night, I didn't wait for the sound. I sat in the dark, shotgun across my lap, staring at the front window. Midnight passed. Then 1. Then 2. The crickets had gone quiet. And even the wind had stilled. Like the whole world was holding its breath. And then, without a sound, the face was there again. Closer this time, so close I could make out every detail. Pale skin stretched thin. Lips colorless, nose flattened against the glass. But the eyes, God, the eyes weren't right. Too wide, too black, like 2 holes punched into the night. And the mouth started to move. I couldn't hear it, not through the glass. But I saw the lips forming words. Slow, careful, over and over, let me in. Let me in. I raised the shotgun, finger trembling on the trigger. But some awful part of me was frozen, transfixed by those eyes. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in that silent conversation, before I finally pulled the trigger. The blast shattered the window, spraying shards across the room. The recoil nearly knocked me down. When the smoke cleared, the face was gone. But the next morning, I found no blood, no body, just the glass blown outward, like the shot had come from outside the house, not in. I patched the window. I told myself that would be the end of it. But the thing is, every night since, I still hear it. Gravel popping, breathing by the door, tapping at the glass. And sometimes, when I wake up in the dead stillness of 3 a.m., I swear I see it again, not outside this time, but inside, reflected in the black glass of the turned-off TV, standing behind me, grinning wide, mouthing the same words. Story 2. The man at the bedroom window. I used to live in Longview, Texas, out past the parts of town that had sidewalks and working street lamps. It wasn't quite country, not quite city, just that ugly in-between, where things are too far apart to feel safe but too close together to feel private. The little house I rented was almost skeletal, a one-bedroom shack with warped floorboards and window screens that rattled in the wind. The landlord bragged that it had character, which is another way of saying it was too broken down to charge anyone real money for. The rent was cheap, though, and cheap was king back then. I'd just gotten out of a bad breakup, was broke most weeks, and wanted somewhere quiet where I could drink myself to sleep without neighbors hearing. The house was set back off a cracked road, with one other structure across the way, a narrow, sagging shotgun house that I never once saw occupied. The grass around it was waist-high, windows dark, porch steps collapsing. I figured it had been abandoned years ago. That detail mattered to me. It meant I wouldn't have to deal with anybody staring across the yard, watching me come and go. For the first month, things were fine. Lonely, but fine. I worked, came home, cooked cheap dinners, and tried not to think too much about the silence that pressed in on the place at night. Then, one night, I woke up. No reason I could tell. Just snapped awake like someone had pulled a string in my chest. I rolled over in bed, half asleep still, and that's when I saw him. There was a man at the window. Not a shadow, not a trick of light, a man. He stood inches from the glass, face level with mine, staring inside. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. His skin looked pale even in the dark, like he'd been drained of blood, and his eyes were these hollow pits, black and wet-looking, fixed straight on me. I froze, every nerve in my body lit up like a live wire. My first thought wasn't even fear. It was confusion, like my brain couldn't make sense of the shape I was seeing. My second thought was that I was dreaming. It had to be a dream. But then his breath fogged the glass. I saw the condensation bloom out in little clouds. I shot upright, heart slamming, and yanked the thin curtain shut with shaking hands. I sat there for the rest of the night, listening, holding my hammer like it was a lifeline. I didn't go back to sleep until the sun rose. The next morning, I forced myself to check outside. My hands were sweating so bad I almost dropped the doorknob. But there was nothing. The dirt under the window was smooth. No footprints. No broken grass. Just empty earth. That should have comforted me. But it didn't. It made it worse. Because it left me with no explanation. For a few nights, nothing happened. I convinced myself I'd dreamed it. Stress, exhaustion, the house itself making me crazy. Then, a week later, I woke again. Same time, same feeling. Heart pounding before my eyes even opened. I turned toward the window. He was there again. This time he was closer. His face was pressed against the glass. Lips pulled back slightly like he was smiling. Though it wasn't joy, it was hunger. His eyes shone with some slick blackness, and the skin around them looked bruised. I pulled the curtains so fast I nearly ripped them. I didn't sleep again that night, or the one after, when he came back. It became a pattern. Every few nights, always between 2 and 3 in the morning, I'd wake and find him there, staring. Sometimes he was inches away. Sometimes he stood further back, barely visible. But always there, always waiting. I called the sheriff's department. A deputy came out. Young guy with a drooping mustache who looked bored more than concerned. He checked the property, stomped around the dirt under the window, and came back shaking his head. Ain't nothing here. You sure you didn't dream it? I wanted to believe that. God, I wanted to. But the way he looked at me told me he didn't believe it either. He thought I was drunk or crazy. I nailed the bedroom window shut, put up heavier curtains, slept with every light in the house blazing. Didn't matter. Because one night, I woke up and the curtains were already drawn shut. And he was inside. He stood at the foot of my bed, silent. His body stiff and pale as if he'd been soaking in water for weeks. The air smelled wrong, damp earth, mildew, rot. My throat closed. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. He leaned down until his face was inches from mine. His lips didn't move, but I heard his voice, hollow and cold, in my head. You live where I died. And then he was gone. Just gone. No sound, no trace, nothing. I tore that house apart, opened every closet, every crawl space, even slid under the house in the dirt like a lunatic. There was nothing. No man. No intruder. Just me, shaking, filthy, and more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. I lasted one more week before I packed up everything I could fit in my truck and left. I didn't even lock the door. Didn't care. The landlord called a few months later, asking if I wanted to come back for the rest of my things. I told him to keep them, burn them. I didn't care. He mentioned, offhand, that the house had burned down anyway. Lightning strike, he said. Fire started in the bedroom. I never asked questions. And I never drive past that road in Longview again. Story 3. White dress at the fence line. My uncle lived in Kerrville, Texas, on a patch of land that looked more like a graveyard for rusted equipment than a farm. Old tractors leaned sideways into the dirt. Piles of mesquite branches smoldered in the heat. And the fences sagged so badly you could step right over them. He'd lived there all his life. But age had gotten the better of him. A bad knee surgery put him mostly in a chair. So he called me up one summer and asked if I'd help out with the brush clearing. He gave me his trailer to sleep in. It was a narrow, tin-sided thing that reeked of cigarette smoke and pine sol. The bedroom was his, so I got the couch in the living room. That couch faced the sliding glass door, which looked out over the pasture. Uncle never put curtains on it because he said he liked seeing the sunrise. At night, though, it was just a black square reflecting back whatever dim lamp you left on. The first time I saw her, it was close to midnight. I woke up for no reason, the way you sometimes do in an unfamiliar place, and turned toward the glass. She was standing out by the fence line. A woman, too far to see her face, but her white dress glowed against the dark pasture like it was catching moonlight. She wasn't moving, not swaying with the wind, not adjusting her weight like a living person would. She just stood there, facing the trailer. I stared until my eyes watered, convinced I was imagining it. When I finally blinked, she was gone. I woke my uncle anyway, shaking his shoulder until he groaned and cursed at me. When I told him, he shuffled into the living room, squinting out into the dark. Nothing. Just the pasture, the fence, the tree line. He muttered something about city boys and their nerves and went back to bed. The next night, she was there again. Closer this time. Standing just beyond the fence, her pale face faintly visible in the dark. My stomach turned to ice. I didn't move, didn't breathe, because something in me knew, if I acknowledged her, she'd come closer. When I finally passed out from exhaustion, the sun was already warming the sky. My uncle believed me the next morning. Not because of anything I said, but because of the handprints. Greasy smears marked the glass door. 5 long fingers pressed right where my head had been on the couch. The prints weren't mine. They were too long, too thin. Like they'd been made by someone who'd spent years clawing at something. Uncle just stared at them a long while, his jaw tight, then wiped them away with a rag. "Don't go outside after dark," was all he said. I didn't, but she kept coming back. Every night, closer, closer, until the white of her dress filled the glass. I never saw her move. She'd just be closer. I lay frozen on the couch, listening to the trailer's aluminum siding creak like a heartbeat, too scared even to pull the blanket over my face. On my last night there, I woke to silence so deep it roared in my ears. The kind of silence you only notice when something's wrong. I turned my head. The glass door was open. She was inside, kneeling beside the couch, her white dress soaked and dirty up close, her skin pale as candle wax, Her hair hung in wet ropes, dripping onto the linoleum. Her face was inches from mine, eyes black as oil, no whites at all. Her mouth opened and closed, not breathing, just shaping words without sound. When I finally heard them, they weren't through my ears. They were inside my head, low and hollow. I used to live here. The smell hit me then, damp soil, rot, like something long buried and dragged out of the earth. I bolted upright, screaming. Uncle limped in, shotgun in hand, but by then she was gone. The glass door was shut, latched from the inside. The next morning, I left Kerrville. I didn't look back. Years later, I asked my uncle about her. He didn't want to talk, but after a few drinks he told me the trailer had belonged to his cousin. Back in the 80s. A young woman. She disappeared one night and was never found. Folks said she probably ran off with a boyfriend, but her family never believed it. Uncle didn't either. He'd never said why. Story 4. The Smiling Stranger. Back in 2009. I lived in a duplex on the edge of Fort Worth. One of those old red brick buildings, built cheap in the 70s, with walls thin enough that you could hear your neighbor sneeze. My unit was in the back row, right where the alley ran behind the building. The kind of alley nobody used, a stretch of cracked pavement overgrown with weeds, lined with broken fences and sagging utility poles. It felt like a no man's land, forgotten by the city. A place stray dogs and drunk kids claimed after dark. The bedroom window in my unit faced that alley. It wasn't big, just wide enough for an air conditioner, and it sat low enough that you could look in if you were standing outside. When I first moved in, I thought nothing of it. I was working late shifts, barely home before midnight, and I was too tired most nights to care. But then the tapping started. It was faint, just a light tick-tick-tick against the glass. I thought at first it was branches or bugs, but there were no trees close enough, and the sound was too precise. I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, holding my breath while it went on. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up. He was there. A man, standing in the alley, face pressed to the glass. His skin looked smeared with dirt, like he'd clawed his way out of the ground. His teeth were too big for his mouth, yellow and sharp-looking, bared in a smile so wide it looked painful. He didn't blink, didn't move, just smiled at me, tapping the glass with something, a coin, maybe, or his fingernail. I scrambled for my phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. When I looked back, he was gone. The cops came, stomped around the alley with flashlights, and asked me if I'd been drinking. They said they'd keep an eye out. That was the end of it, officially. But not for me. He came back the next night, and the night after that. Always smiling, always tapping. Sometimes he stood a little further back, half hidden in the shadows, but I could always see his teeth. That grin stretched ear to ear. Other times, he pressed his face so close to the glass that I could see the cracks in his lips, the dark spit shining between his teeth. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom. I dragged a blanket to the couch and tried to convince myself he'd lose interest if he didn't see me. But that first night on the couch, I woke to the same sound. Tap, tap, tap. This time it came from the living room window. I froze, pulling the blanket up to my chin, praying I was wrong. But when I looked, he was there again, crouched low, smile wider than ever, teeth glowing in the dark like bone. After that, I barely slept. I kept the lights on. I played the TV all night to drown out the silence, but nothing helped. He didn't care if I moved rooms, didn't care if I hid. He always found me. One night, I decided I'd catch him. I sat in the dark with my phone camera ready, staring at the window. I told myself if I could get proof, a picture, a video, the police would have to believe me. Hours passed, the clock ticking loud enough to hurt. Until finally, right at 3 in the morning, he appeared. But not at the window. In the reflection. He was behind me. I spun around so fast the phone flew out of my hands. The room was empty. Just the couch, the flickering TV, and the locked front door. But when I looked back at the glass, he was still there in the reflection, grinning, standing only a foot behind me. I moved out 2 days later. Left furniture, dishes, everything. I didn't care. I found another place clear across town. No alley, no low windows. For a while, I thought I'd left him behind. But then I saw him at a gas station late at night, standing outside by the pumps, grinning at me through the windshield. A month later, I caught him in the grocery store parking lot, staring across rows of cars. Just last year, I saw him in the rearview mirror, sitting in the back seat of the car behind mine at a red light. He doesn't knock anymore, doesn't tap. He just smiles, and is always closer than I want him to be. Story 5. The Drowned Boy of Livingston. When my parents packed up the U-Haul and drove us out past the highway toward Lake Livingston, I thought we were escaping something smaller than what we found. The farmhouse sat alone at the end of a gravel lane, swallowed by pines and laurel oaks, the kind of place that smelled like wetwood and motor oil. Neighbors said it had been empty for years. The mailbox leaned to one side and the porch steps sagged like a tired mouth. For Dad it was a good deal, cheap land, cheaper house, and for Mom it meant a bigger kitchen and the kind of quiet she liked. For me, 13 and certain the world was built around my discomforts, it was the end of normal things, friends, the community center, the mall. It was all gone. What I didn't know then was how the house had its own memory, how empty rooms and old floorboards can keep the shape of what happened inside them. My room had the biggest window. It faced the back pasture where the land dropped down toward the lake, and every afternoon the glass smoked with heat. At night the window reflected the room back at you, a square of pale light, a little island of mattress and dresser and posters. Mom never liked curtains. She said curtains were for people who wanted to hide something. I always felt exposed in that room, like whatever was out there could look right through me and then walk in as if it had every right. That first summer, the lake was a rumor of glitter through trees. We swam once, and the water felt like glass against my calves, cold and quick to steal warmth. The town kids told the usual stories about the lake, boats gone missing, old men who saw things in the reeds. You learn the rules early in places like that. Don't leave beer near the water. Don't go out after dark alone. And don't stare at shapes in the surf. My parents laughed at the stories and told me not to be ridiculous. The first time I saw him, I didn't know what to name it. At 2 a.m, I woke to the taste of salt in my mouth, like I'd been holding it there all night. It's a weird feeling to wake with your body insisting on drowning when you're perfectly dry. But there it was. I lay still because of the way the house can make small noises bigger. A settling board, the wind snagging at the eaves, and I tried to ignore it. Then in the square of window lights someone moved. He was a kid, I think about my age, but wrong in the way children can be wrong in dreams. Water pooled at his shoes, hair matted flat to his scalp, clothes plastered to his body as if he'd just climbed out of the lake. He stood in the yard, not running or calling, not doing any of the things you expect a kid to do. He stood like someone who'd been holding still a very long time, looking at me through the glass. His face was pale and wet, his mouth opened slightly like he was breathing underwater. He raised his hand and dragged a single finger down the glass, leaving a thin trail of streaks that caught the moonlight. I screamed for my dad and he came stumbling in with a flashlight, slippers soft on the floor, and by the time he lunged to the window, the boy was gone. We fumbled through the screen, spitting and peering into the dark. There were depressions in the grass, like someone had been standing there, but the ground was not marshy or recently disturbed, just summer crusting, earth and a scattering of crushed pine needles. Dad patted his pockets like a man trying to find logic in a sudden chaos. Probably a raccoon or a kid from down the lane, he said. He drove over to the neighbor's place and banged on the door until some old guy yawned and said he'd seen nothing. The house settled back down into its quiet and we slept, or pretended to. That was the first time. After that, the appearances changed, like the house was learning all its ways of being wrong. Sometimes, when I woke in the night, he'd be closer, inches away from the glass, water dripping down his arms, the pale of his face lit like a drowned thing under an aquarium lamp. Sometimes he'd stand at the tree line on the hill above the lake, where the shadows pulled like ink, and he would look like a child-shaped absence, not quite solid. I would blink and he'd be gone. Once he was in the window reflection behind me. I looked away from the pane to see if something was passing in the room, and when I looked back, the reflection had a face that wasn't mine. It was the boy's, breath fogging the simulated glass of reflection. You get used to things, or you learn how not to. I learned, very young, how to pretend not to notice. I pulled a blanket over my head more nights than I care to admit and counted the number of breaths I took until the light came. Mom told me to stop being melodramatic. Dad said we were having a run of bad dreams, stress from the move. They humored me at first, but as summer wore on there was a change in their faces, a tiny darkening behind their eyes that didn't match any exhaustion. One night Mom missed a call to check on Aunt Sissy because she woke and sat very still on the couch, hands in her lap, eyes fixed on the back window like she'd seen some new weather. There were the small things, too. Footprints leading from the tree line down to the porch, not deep like an adult's, but the slender prints of a kid, pressed shallow in the dust and filled with dew. An impression in the porch step, where someone had knelt and left the varnish wearing off in a perfect crescent. My baseball glove left on the back step the week before would be found a few feet from its place, damp and smelling faintly of algae. Once our dog, a thin mutt named Cisco, refused to go near the back door for 3 days and ate little, which is the kind of thing that makes a simple man's beliefs tilt towards superstition. The town has its own memory, the kind that coils in bars and laundromats where older folks gossip in pieces. I started to hear hints, a boy who'd gone missing one summer, years back, when the lake was low and the searchers pulled up nothing but root balls. A kid who liked to stand on the dock and skip stones into the dark, who got a laugh from someone and turned and wasn't there when his mother called. It was the kind of story people pull out and look at, like a bone, then put back. When I asked my dad about it directly, he shut me down with the efficiency of a man who didn't want to reopen old wounds. Those are stories, he said. People remember things wrong. But his jaw had a tightness that told me he'd not been sleeping easy either. The boy's closeness felt like an accusation. Once, lying awake, I watched him stand right at the window, his hand pressed to the glass as if he could feel what was in my room. His lips moved soundlessly like someone trying to mouth words without air. I wanted to go out there so badly I could taste it, to take his hand and pull him inside, to ask him why he wouldn't move on, but I was a kid, and whatever step crossed from picture to person held the weight of adult terrors. I sat very still and watched until dawn peeled the night away and he melted like frost. As the summer narrowed, my sleep turned to long ragged snaps between moments of electricity and then fear. I started to see him in the daylight, though he was never quite the same. One hot afternoon, I walked down to the lake with a friend. We joked about the scarecrow of a kid people half remembered. I swear it was only when my friend tossed a stone and I turned that I saw him standing far along the marsh. So still the reeds didn't even seem to move. I blinked, and he was gone. Sometimes the boy looked at me with something that felt like anger. Other times he seemed just sad, a boredom stretched thin. Once, after an afternoon thunderstorm, I found a line of water running down the inside of my bedroom window in a clean finger trail pattern, like someone had dragged their wet hand over the glass from top to bottom. I wiped it away and felt, absurdly, like I had cleaned some old smear off of the world. The final night was ordinary in the way the most awful things are ordinary. Dinner, the muted TV, rain starting again on the tin roof. The generator for our well buzzed its small complaint. I couldn't sleep. Between the quiet and the steady drum of weather, a tension had been building for days that made my limbs hum. I lay awake on my back and watched the night move slow on the ceiling. The wind had a taste to it, salt and something older, like bones in a drawer. He came, of course. He always did. This time he didn't stand outside. The glass was fogged in a way it had not been before, a cloud between me and him. He was inches from the pane. When he pressed his face to the glass, the wetness on his cheeks left a smear, and his lips shaped words, though I could not hear them. My chest ached with the need to understand. I slid out of bed before I knew I had moved, wrapped a towel around me, and pushed the window open. The night was a sheet of sound and rain. There, where the yard sloped down toward the lake, the grasses were slick with water and the footprints were fresh. I listened, the kind of listening that makes your blood run cold, because in the hush of a sleeping world you can sometimes hear the things that stay buried. The boy stood a few feet away, higher up on the small rise. his feet sunk in the grass like they belonged there. He did not look like any child alive. His eyes had that glassy openness you see in fish, and his hands were too long. His voice when he finally let it out was a thin, wet rasp, like wind through reeds. "Help," he said. It might have been a plea or a command. I knew then something complicated and old lived in the shape of his asking. I had the sudden foolish, feral thought to run and take him inside, to offer a towel and a sandwich, to undo whatever wrong had been done to him. But whatever made him solid enough to say the word also held a gravity, an oldness. You learn quickly. Kids learn fastest. There are things you cannot touch without breaking. The boy sank down into the grass and began to whistle, a tiny sound like air through a bottle. As he did, I watched the surface of the lake flare briefly, like something under the water had turned. The black of it shifted and opened, not in ripples but as if some small shape rolled and turned. A thing the size of a child but not a child slipped free of the water line and dove beneath like it had been waiting for him. That sight nailed something in me with a quiet so heavy I could have screamed. The boy's mouth opened and I saw inside, teeth dark and uneven and clean like they'd been in the deep too long. He smiled then, and it was not a child's smile. My brain spun like the sky does in a bad dream. The words of the adults in the town, the stories of the missing, the way the lake could take and return nothing. These joined into a single grotesque geometry. I moved without thinking. I ran toward him, but I never touched him. When I reached out, his face blurred and folded like wet cloth. He rose in a slow, unpleasant way out of the grass and then was gone, vanished from the slope as if the hill itself had swallowed him. We left a week later. The house sold quick after that. They painted the porch and put new numbers on the mailbox. Like a clean coat would erase the past. I grew up and moved to a different town, and the memory of the boy became a thing I pushed into the back of the closet of my mind. The way people shelve terrifying things so they can function. But you cannot delete everything by moving. Years later, when my own kids were small and I liked to get away from the city for weekends, I drove back to Lake Livingston out of nostalgia and no small amount of fear. My father had been dead a few years by then. The house sat empty and new owners had landscaped the yard into tidy lawns. I stood at the old gravel lane and looked toward the water. There were jet skis now and docks in neat rows. Sound systems playing the same songs over and over. People laughed. And still, when the light shifted, when the sun went low and the water took on that particular leaden color, I thought I saw a shape, a small pale face at the tree line. Water in its hair, watching. The lake keeps things. It is patient. Sometimes, at night, when the house is silent except for the refrigerator's small breath, I wake with that salt taste again and feel the memory like a hand at the back of my neck. I've never been able to explain it to anyone, in a way that didn't sound like a childhood story haunted by too much imagination. But there are times when the children around here get lost for a few hours and come back with pockets full of frogs and eyes too wide, and their parents tell them to wash off that smell. And if you've been around lakes in August, you know how ordinary it is for the dark to look like someone once more. I never named him because names feel like ownership, and naming something small can make it an explanation. There are some things an explanation cannot make whole again. There are some doors you never open because the thing on the other side doesn't belong to you and never will. The boy at the window belonged to the lake and the dark and the long memory of water. And sometimes when I stand by still water at dusk, I can feel him watching me back, patient, waiting for the long slow pull of things the lake keeps and gives up only when it wants to. Story 6. Dead Eyes on the Glass. We bought the cabin on a whim. Or at least that's what my husband liked to tell people when they asked how two city people wound up with a weathered little house 30 minutes from Canyon Lake. He said it like it made sense. A break from the grind. A weekend place where we could drink coffee on the porch and pretend the rest of the world didn't exist. The realtor showed us the pictures. Knotty pine walls. A stone fireplace. A back deck that hung over scrub and cedar. The price was low, the seller in a hurry. And the paperwork, when it came, had fewer pages than most of the leases we'd signed in our lives. We signed, paid, and drove out on a Friday evening just after sunset. The sky bruised purple and quiet. The place was smaller than it looked in pictures. The kind of place where you can clap in the middle and touch too. Walls without moving your feet. You could hear the creek somewhere behind the trees. And at night the cicadas made the world tremble. It was exactly what we wanted at first. Privacy. A little distance. A weekend escape. The first night we stayed there we drank cheap wine in front of the fireplace. And fell asleep. To the low hum of the refrigerator. And the wind in the pines. No one was around for miles. It felt, at the beginning, like being nestled in a pocket of the world where you could breathe. The first sign I didn't like the place was small. A smear on the living room window that looked, in the wide-angle light, like someone had rested a damp hand there. It was the kind of smear you could forget about if you wanted to. I told myself that first morning. I dragged branches against the glass when I trimmed the hedges. My husband, Mark, laughed and called me paranoid. We washed the glass and went on with our weekend. We made pancakes, hiked a short trail and sat on the deck watching dust mote spin. The second night we were there, I woke near 2 in the morning with a inexplicable certainty that someone was watching me. There's a specific shape to that kind of waking. Your brain alerts first. A small white flag that something is wrong, and then your body follows. I lay there, listening. The house creaked. The refrigerator whirred. The wind made a low, hollow sound through the eaves. I peeled back the blanket and walked barefoot to the living room where the sliding glass doors opened onto the deck and the dark. A man was standing on the other side of the glass. He was close enough that his face filled half the pane. Close enough that breathing fogged the glass where his mouth was. I didn't run. I don't know why. There's a paralysis that happens in moments like that, not just fear but a stunned wanting to know what the thing is. He was about my age, maybe a little older, and his clothes hung on him like they were still drying. His skin had the dull grey of something that had been long wet. His eyes were the first thing that stopped me. Not black. Not the normal white and dark you expect, but like pits where the light folded and died. They were empty, like someone had taken the shine out of them. Dead eyes. I blinked, and his face was still there, pressed to the glass. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He just watched with those awful, hollow sockets. The smell hit me then, a cold, river sour scent, damp and wrong. I fumbled for my phone and turned the flashlight on, the beam cutting the night into a hard line. When the light hit the glass, the man's face blurred and slid away like oil. I waited for him to come around the side or to be visible behind the trees. But when I stepped out onto the deck, the night was empty. No footprints in the dust. Nothing disturbed beyond the normal scatter of needles and the way small animals make the ground uneven. I told Mark in the morning, hands still shaking, and he made coffee with the same practiced, soothing motions people learn when they want to make their loved ones feel better. He said it was a trick of light, of shadow. We were tired. The road and the drive and the silence. He said the kind of things that hold together the practical world. He suggested we hang some curtains. We hung curtains. They were thick, unattractive drapes. That made the living room feel closer and more claustrophobic during the day. At night, I pulled them tight and slept with the lamp on. The man didn't return for a while, and I told myself my fear was a thin thing, the kind imagination knits in dark hours. Then, the third night, I woke to a sound like someone wiping glass from the other side of the room. I sat up and listened and realized I could hear breathing, not from anywhere in the house but somehow from the window itself, soft, cold, like air moving through an empty bottle. I went to the window, hand flat against the curtain, and the fabric felt as if something were pressing it from the other side in a slow, steady rhythm. The shape of a hand pushed out, fingers blade. I could have ignored it. I could have stayed in bed and pretended it wasn't happening. But once you step over that line of knowing, you don't get to step back. I slipped the curtain open, heart like a fist, and there he was again, inches away. Dead eyes, face pale as paper, breath fogging the glass. Only this time he wasn't only outside. When I looked closely, the glass wasn't clean. It had prints, like someone had dragged their fingers across it, and the smudges showed the outline of a face pressed hard enough to leave shape. "Go away," I said, because people say words even when there's no logic to them. The man did nothing. He kept looking. I could have reached out and touched the glass and maybe broken it. Instead, I retreated, shaky, and told Mark, and he came out. A little childish bravado in his step that was, supposed to fight away the sliver of fear. In his own chest. He stared at the pane, then put his palm to the glass. It didn't feel cold to him. It felt like glass. When he wiped a hand over it, the prince came away in a streak of dust. He slept between us with his back to the window that night while I sat awake and counted the minutes until the sky in the east tensed toward dawn. After that, things escalated slowly as sickness does. The man's visits became almost nightly, sometimes later, sometimes earlier. Once he pressed his face to the glass. At noon, the way a child might press his nose to a fish tank. And the horror of it felt worse because it happened in the bright, ordinary part of the day. He never spoke. He never moved from watching. He didn't seem to breathe. He only watched, and when he left, it was always as if the glass remembered his presence. A wet trail. A set of prints. We began to find other things too. A smear near the back door. Like a hand had dragged itself down the siding. A rusted coin balanced on the deck rail. The feather of a bird stuck to the screen. We called the sheriff once. The deputy was good-humored and skeptical and made polite noises about people playing pranks or drunks, wandering the woods. He walked the perimeter, shining his flashlight and calling into the trees. There were no prints in the soft dirt near the house. There was no sign of anyone hiding in the cedars. He left with the same professional shrug he gives to most calls. Nothing found. The sheriff told us to keep the doors locked. We kept the doors locked. We kept the curtains closed. We bought motion light sensors and strung them around the deck. The sensor would snap on sometimes in the dead hours and flood the yard with bright light. And for a long time that made me think I'd seen the man run when the bulbs flashed. But he never ran. He never moved. Sometimes the motion light clicked on and illuminated nothing. Once the light came on and revealed prints, leading to the deck and then stopping at the steps like someone had floated into the air. Once the light came on and the bell on the sensor chattered and nothing answered. We tried to be rational. We filled the cabin with friends one weekend so there'd be witnesses. A crowd sitting around the fireplace, drinks in hand, laughter covering the hours. Late that night, when most of the others had gone to sleep, I woke to a silence that felt placed around me like a lid. I went to the living room and there, curtains were open just enough to let a sliver of night in. And on the other side of the glass he stood, exactly where the drape gap was, his face filling the gap. He hadn't been there when I'd gone to bed. He wasn't there when I'd checked earlier. He must have come then, in the small space when the house's noise slept. I turned on the porch light. His face blurred at the rim of illumination and then was gone. One of the guests, a woman named Denise, swore she'd seen a shadow outside and that her dog had growled. The next morning everyone said they'd slept through the night and remembered nothing. People like to forget. The feeling in the house shifted. It became like a room you can't keep clean. Something clings to the corners. The air was heavier. And sometimes in the morning, you'd smell that sour river smell and think of the creek. Mark began leaving for late drives. The sort of errands that were really just driving to clear his head. We had conversations that stopped when the phrase "I saw it" came up because neither of us could say more without sounding insane. On the last visit before the end, the man pressed his palms to the glass and left the imprints down the center of the pane. The outlines of fingers and palms were abnormal, too long. The joints knuckled like a clawed hand. When I reached out and traced them with my fingertip, cold leaked into my skin and a tremor ran up my arm. The house felt suddenly enormous, as if the walls could unroll and swallow you if given the chance. I'd asked Mark the night before whether anyone had lived in the house before, us who had been ill. He had shrugged and said the cellar. Said the previous owner had moved to be closer to family. He hadn't looked at the records. Nobody mentioned a death. Houses hide their history unless someone digs. We were there alone. It was Thanksgiving weekend. The road back to the city should have been full of everyone else's holiday traffic, their lights and errands. But there was an easy empty to the world that made the cabin feel, in that moment, like a small island. That night the air had a frost bite to it. I woke sometime after midnight to the sound of glass clicking, a soft, insistent noise like knuckles tapping the window pane. The curtains were closed, but the noise was metallic and steady. I pulled them aside. He stared at me, and the face I saw then wasn't just outside. It was everywhere in the surface of the glass. He had the same dead eyes, the same wet hair clinging to a forehead. He was closer than he had any other time, his face pressing so hard it seemed as if the whole pane would bow inward. I felt like he was looking through me into something behind my skin. I noticed then that his mouth hung at the corner, and in it, between grey teeth, was the glint of something like a coin. I opened the glass, the latch groaning, my hands numb. The cold rushed in like a hand. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He only watched. I remember the thought at the time, an absurd, childish wish to reach out and touch him and see if he was real. I remember the way the air tasted, metallic, like pennies, or the taste of a river on a hot day, and I reached toward the glass, my fingertips hovering over the prints he'd left. When my finger touched the pane, it felt wrong. It felt not like glass but like skin stretched over bone. The contact sent a jolt through me, and for a second the world went thick and slow. The pressure came from the other side of the glass then, sudden and forceful, and I heard a sound like someone trying to get out of a jar. My hand stung as if I'd been grabbed. I pulled back reflexively, and the lurch of surprise made me stumble. Mark snapped awake and lit a lamp. When he saw what I'd done, he moved toward the door with a kind of frightening calm. We stood there, both of us, in that light looking out. The man was gone. We left that night. We drove down the lane, our bags in the trunk, our hands white around the steering wheel. We didn't lock the cabin. When I turned back through the rear window, I saw the living room lit for a second like someone had a match. The curtain twitched and then fell still. I thought then, and I thought this with the strange rational clarity fear gives you, that we'd left something behind. A month later, I drove out with a box of things I'd missed. I told myself I was brave, that I needed to see the place and close that circle. The road was worse than I remembered. The air smelled of diesel and pine. When the cabin came into view, it looked exactly the same and utterly different. The deck rail had weathered a new grey, and the stone chimney stolen a darker blotch where moss had crept. The drapes in the living room window were closed. I parked and walked up the steps with my key, the metal cold in my hand. When I pulled the curtain aside and peered in, the living room was empty except for the dust motes that rode the shafts of light. And on the pane, front and center where a face would appear, were the prints, not long, not clawed this time, but clear and round around the edges. The ridges of fingertips like the print you make when you press too hard. My first reaction was relief. They'd washed the glass at some point, and the stale things had been cleaned. But then I saw the smear lower down, like a thumb dragged across a cheek, and something else, faint at first, a barely visible outline in the reflection of the glass, an afterimage. The reflection wasn't mine. It took me a long minute to understand. I saw my own shoulders, the grey of my sweatshirt, the way my hair fell, and behind that, slightly to the right, the shape of a face pressed to the glass from the other side of the pane. The face wasn't clear. It was the idea of a face, a negative. Where eyes should have been were empty wells. The outline matched the prints. I stood there utterly, stupidly still for a long while until the air seemed to move and I had to step back. That afternoon I called the county records office and asked who had owned the property before us. The clerk was polite and slow and told me some names. There was no death recorded at the house. The phone calls I made afterward, to neighbors, to the realtor, to a man who used to run a bait shop, yielded the kind of answers people give when they don't have a story in them. That no one had ever reported anything, that the seller had moved to be nearer children, that sometimes old houses make old noises, but the man at the glass, whatever he'd been, had a presence no paper could erase. At home, the thing followed us a little. I saw the mirror in the downstairs bathroom, and for a second in its dull glass I thought I saw the hollow of empty eyes behind mine. It was always a trick then, a light catching a crease, the tiredness under my skin. I told myself stories to explain every sighting. The rational world is good at building those scaffolds. Then, on a rain-sleek August night a year later, when the city was humid and the windows rattled, I stood in front of my bedroom window and caught a flash of motion in a car's rearview mirror momentarily. Parked outside my house. A glimpse of something leaning close to the glass. I went to the window and for a second the reflection was wrong. It wasn't just me, but a face aligned oddly behind my shoulder, with the same dead-set, non-living eyes I'd seen at the cabin. I called Mark into the room and showed him. He looked, and he laughed in that brittle way people do when they are being brave for show. He said it was my nerves. He said we imagined things because we'd been through a stressful year. He put his hand on my shoulder and that gesture felt hollow. I felt hollow too. I slept poorly that night. The end came abruptly and quietly. A Tuesday, ordinary. I was doing dishes at the sink, the radio murmuring in the background, when the phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I listened to a voice on the line, a clerk, something official sounding, telling me to come down to the station. Mark had been in a small wreck at a red light. He was alive, they said. He'd been taken in the ambulance. I drove like a caged animal, my hands white on the steering wheel, the world in a blur. At the hospital, they told me something else. Mark had been found in his car with his face smashed against the windshield. The report said he'd swerved to avoid something on the road and struck the barrier. The paramedics said his face had been pressed to the glass, as if he'd been looking at something. I couldn't reconcile the two details. How did you swerve at midnight and press your face to the glass at the same time? The officer in the hallway tried to be helpful and said maybe he'd fallen asleep and hit the guardrail. He said these things, the kinds of things that try to stitch the world back into a clean seam. At home that night, I sat in the dark and watched the window. The house was small, the cushions still in the same place. The living room glass reflected my silhouette like a pale matchstick. For a long time I stared at it and my own reflection looked like something I could control. I let myself think I had the only truth now. A man had been taken by an accident. Maybe whatever I'd seen before had been grief or suggestion. Then, slowly, deliberately, a face leaned up against the windowpane behind me. It was not the past repeating. It was new. It was close and cold enough that I could feel the imprint it had left in the air. When I turned, the man was there, pressed so hard his features blurred. His dead eyes focused on me like a command. My breath left me. I felt the world tilt. When I stepped forward, the reflection in the glass moved with me, but behind it the face stayed. It was impossible until it was not. I stood there, small and ridiculous, and the face watched. For a moment I thought my own reflection's eyes had darkened. Then my hands went numb. In the glass, the face behind my reflection leaned its forehead against the pane next to mine. And where the two pressed, the prints showed, long fingers, the slight curl of a thumb, the rim of a coin caught in the mouth like a glint. I didn't know how long I stood there. Time had the texture of syrup. The world narrowed to a ring of light around the window. Behind my reflection, the dead eyes blinked once, slow and deliberate. The sound in my chest felt like an animal waking. After that, small things changed. I would wake and find the glass fogged, from the inside even, though the heaters were off. I would look and in the faint condensation there would be the shadow of pressed lips. The prints on the inside of the glass were always faint, as if someone had tried to make them and then failed. Friends said they saw it too, when they visited. They mentioned it in passing and then left, awkward. Or perhaps they didn't see it at all and said nothing because the world is good at pretending nothing. Unusual is happening. I don't know which is worse. I started to notice my reflection more. In windows, in the back of spoons, in the dark glass of the TV. Sometimes the reflection was mine, and sometimes it was not quite mine. Sometimes the hollow of something else sat behind my eyes like a shadow. I began to move through rooms with the small, careful steps of someone avoiding old glass. I avoided looking at mirrors for long periods. I slept in the bed with the lamp on and the curtains fully drawn. It didn't help. One spring night I woke up and the house was quiet as cotton. I walked to the living room because the sensation that had woken me was the same. One that had started all of this. The sense of being watched. The curtains were slightly open, a slit of night in the pane. I peered out and there, pressed to the O. Story 7. The Crawler at the Third Floor. When the landlord handed me the keys to the top floor unit, he bragged about the view. "You'll see the whole block from up there," he said, as if the town itself were a prize you could hold up and examine. The complex was one of those thin, 3-story brick buildings that had been shoehorned into the older part of Lubbock. It had been a rental for decades, the kind of place where the carpet knew the shape of 1,000 shoes and the stairwell smelled like activity and old cigarettes. I took the place because it was cheap and on the edge of my budget, and because I liked being high up. There was a safety in elevation, I thought then, a quiet arrogance in being above street level and its small cruelties. My bedroom window looked down on the parking lot and across at the row of warehouses behind it. There was no balcony, no fire escape, nothing for a person to stand on, which made the sight of a figure there the first time all the more impossible. I woke around 2 in the morning to a skittering sound at the glass like nails dragging across a chalkboard, a sound that prickled the skin at the back of the neck. I rolled over, heart knocking, and peered at the dark square of my window. A man was clinging to the outside of the pane, his hand splayed as if he were a fly stuck to the glass. He wasn't standing on anything. His body hugged the vertical plane as if gravity had been a suggestion he'd simply ignored. He had the long lean of someone who lived outside the rules of ordinary bodies, elbows bent at an odd angle, knees tucked, toes pressed like anchors to air. His face was level with mine, pale in the reflections of the street lamp below, and his eyes were the kind of empty that punches you in the ribs. He looked at me, not like an intruder peering in, but like something that had been waiting a very long time for permission. I froze. There is a peculiar paralysis that comes when the mind cannot file an image into any known category, not dream, not prank, not streetlight. I reached for my phone, thumbed the flashlight on, and when the beam crossed the glass, the man's face rippled for a second, like hot asphalt shivering, and then he was gone. The smearing noise ceased. My heart kept firing like a broken starter motor for half an hour after. The next morning, I told myself it had been a dream. The things that happen to exhausted people are often explained away in daylight, folded into the ordinary. I went to work, mopped diner grease and pasted smiles onto faces that were faded. But I couldn't shake the half-memory of the man's hands splayed flat against my window, of his toes tucked as if he'd been climbing a sheer wall. I told a coworker about it over coffee, and she laughed and said tall buildings and lonely hearts make odd shapes in the dark. I wanted to laugh with her. I couldn't. The second sighting came 3 nights later. I woke to the same skittering sound, a frantic scratching like someone trying to cut through ice. My curtains had been drawn, but the silhouette of a body pressed the fabric out in a shallow bulge. When I slid the curtain aside, the man was there again. Only this time he had his hands at the corners of the window, as if trying to wedge them back towards some seam. The sight was more grotesque than before because his back was to the world and his face toward me, and he seemed to be moving with tiny, quick jerks, inching himself across the glass with a patience that felt older than reason. I called the police at 3 in the morning. The dispatcher sounded bored and asked for my address, repeated it back like a word he had to get through, and assured me an officer would drive by. A deputy showed up in a squad car 20 minutes later, his shoes squeaking on the asphalt. He walked around my building with a flashlight and called out into the night, radio chirping into the dark. He told me he found no footprints, no ladder, no signs of someone climbing. He suggested the possibility of a prank, or my being spooked by too many late-night shows. He left with a polite nod, a standard-issue shrug. After that, I began to notice the scratches during the day, faint lines across the sill as if someone had dragged nails along the paint. I sanded and painted them over, and the lines returned within a week. I slept with a lamp on and the door locked. I started carrying a kitchen knife like a talisman, something clumsy and domestic to make me feel safer. The man returned in the weeks after. Sometimes he would appear at 3 in the morning, sometimes at midnight. Always he was on the outside. Always his toes and fingertips the only things that suggested contact with anything physical. Once, I woke to find the curtains already pulled back, the glass cold beneath my palm. There, reflected in the black mirror of the pane, the man crouched like a spider in mid-climb. I thought I saw his fingers curve in a gesture, as if tracing my outline. He stared through me with an attention I'd never had shared. When the light hit the glass, he blurred and retreated, leaving behind a dampness on the sill like someone who'd been sweating against the frame. There's a slow erosion that happens when terror is not sudden but persistent. You stop cataloguing each event like a discrete wallop and instead live within the shadow it makes. I found my days splitting into before and after. Work became a blur. Nights an exercise in battlements and calculations. Which curtains stayed closed? Which lights left on? How much alcohol dulled the edge of expectation? I stopped inviting people over. I told myself I deserved this solitude, that one day proof would make me sane again. People talk about hauntings like they're metaphors for past guilt or loss. But most of the time the thing is banal. It comes in through a cracked window and explores your life like a house intruder. This thing was different, intimate, precise. It seemed less interested in objects and more interested in the geometry of my life. It watched the angles where I slept, learned the rhythm of my breathing, and then waited, perfectly still, for the moment of weakness when I glanced up. One night, drunk and wretched with sleeplessness, I leaned out the window to measure the distance to the ground. The fall would be terrible, I told myself. Maybe terrible fixes things. The thought was a shameful, hot thing in my chest, and before I knew it, I was at the sill, a hand on the cold frame, imagining the impact like brief clarity. As I stood there, something cold brushed the back of my neck, a phantom pressure like breath. I spun around. A face was pressed to the outside glass 2 inches from mine. The man's mouth moved, and I heard, not through the air but in the hollow of bone, a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard, and then the whispered syllable, "Come." I stumbled back, retching, and that was the worst part. The sense not that he wanted to hurt me, but that he wanted me to be where he was, to trade a place in one world for a place in his. It felt less like an attack and more like a patient negotiation. He would wait and wait until I matched him. After that, my days blurred into a tense calculation. I started watching my reflection in the window for signs of deception, a trick I'd seen in a movie where a person learned to trick the thing by looking strange first. If the man saw only the irregularities, maybe he would lose interest. It was a childish superstition, and sometimes it felt like it worked. Once I painted a circle in the curtain with a Sharpie and kept that blind closed like a button, peering through the peephole to check. One evening a couple months later, the building's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Harrow, who had lived on the first floor since before I was born, knocked on my door and asked if I'd seen anyone climbing the outside. She had the habit of appearing with questions like they were normal civic chores, but her eyes that day were the ringed black of someone who'd been seeing things in the dark. She told me, in a voice that had ceded dramatic flair to the bluntness of truth, that she'd watched from her window and seen it climb. "Not like you think," she said. "It crawled like a spider. Notarial. Father, don't go sticking your hands where they don't belong." She said the old-timers in the building had stopped walking at night when that thing came around. She said a man used to live in the unit below mine, a fellow with the name Anstead, who'd been found on the 3rd floor landing years ago with his face pressed to the glass like someone who'd been trying to watch the world through a jar. They'd said he'd fallen asleep after a drink and slid into the pane. He'd been shaken awake later by neighbors. Nothing had ever been proven. The neighbors' stories are a strange kind of currency in places like old Lubbock rentals. They get traded and embroidered, and sometimes someone dies and the tale is rewritten into morality. But Mrs. Harrow's story was raw in a way the others weren't. She had seen it. She told me she'd seen it press its hands against the window and climb higher and higher, not using a ladder, not touching anything. "It's got too many joints," she said, like it grew them to get where it wants. She added, hushed, that later a kid she knew fell from the roof when he tried to take a dare. The town had an appetite for coincidences. Accidents fed ghosts and ghosts fed accidents. I decided in small, irrational bursts to catch it. Not with police. They'd laughed when I'd called. Their answers medicalized my fear into boredom, but with proof of some sort. I set up an old camcorder on a tripod I'd found in the attic, its little red light an emulation of seriousness. I had it point at the window all night, battery charged, tape rolling. I lay on the bed and jammed a pillow over my face and tried not to listen to the way the house hummed with small life, pipes, a distant dog, the refrigerator's resigned clatter. Hours later, half asleep and raw, I woke to the sound of nails on glass and bared teeth. I flung the pillow off, leapt to the tripod, and found it toppled to the floor. The tape lay jerked and tangled, the red light gone. I rewound and rewound, hands slick with sweat, and watched a grainy stranger's world unravel. Nothing for the first 3 hours. Then a shimmer like heat above the pavement, then a smear, and then a smear turning into shape, a body that crumples flat to a pane. Limbs bending as if they weren't meant to be used that way. The frame skip made it worse. It was almost human. And then wrong, like a puppet with its joints misfitted. There was a gap of 3 minutes where the tape recorded. Only static and a low rustle like something moving close to the mic. The audio picked up a thin clicking, then a whisper so faint my throat seized. Come. I watched the tape until the sun rose and the grain smoothed into morning. The image didn't explain anything. It only made the night real, stubbornly, inexorably real. I made copies. I sent one to a friend who'd believed me in the beginning. He came by and watched with a kind of professional curiosity, face intent. By the time we finished, he sat in the chair for a long time with his hands on his knees. "You need to move," he said finally, and the sentence landed like a verdict. I tried. I called my landlord and told him I needed out. He hemmed and hawed and wanted to raise the rent to cover a transfer. Then he dropped it when he saw my face. He offered to let me out of the lease early if I cleaned the carpets and left the keys. Moving was a kind of small public performance. I boxed up my cheap dishes and books, carted them down 3 flights of stairs that suddenly had different names in my head. Retreat, Exodus. I drove away with the windows of my truck open for once, wanting the wind to slice across my face until it hurt. I told myself I was done with it, done with the 3rd floor, and its painter's hands and the way the man had watched me like he was, counting my breaths. The new place was a single-level house without high windows, without reflective panes that could be climbed. For a while I slept. For a while the nights went by like normal things. No scratches. No laughter in the dark. No cold palms pressing glass. I told myself I'd washed the thing from my life. That complacency was brittle. 6 months later I would wake in the night, sweaty and certain. I heard the rustle of nails at a pane not in my apartment but in a shop window downtown. My reflection in the glass of a passing car would show an afterimage, a thin smear where a hand had been pressed. Once, at a friend's barbecue. I left the group for a moment and stood staring out the kitchen window. For a split second the streetlight caught someone's silhouette climbing the adjacent building like a fly in slow motion. I turned and no one was there. The final image that chased me wasn't a sighting in Lubbock. It was a phone call. On a grey Thursday afternoon. My friend who'd watched the tape called with a voice like someone deflating. He told me he'd been on his roof, fixing shingles in the heat, when he'd lost his balance. He said he'd felt the hitch of his foot and then the sudden cold of the world moving in jerks. He grabbed for the pipe and knew he'd miss. He braced and something with too many jointed hands, wrapped around the outside of the window above him and held him, coiling around the sill like a spider. He said it had felt like being touched by the edge of glass. He said those hands had left prints and then the shape had vanished. He said he climbed down and watched it climb the face of the building, spidering across brick and mortar as if the earth had been a ladder. I watched the tape until the sun rose and the grain smoothed into morning. The image didn't explain anything. It only made the night real, stubbornly, inexorably real. I made copies. I sent one to a friend who'd believed me in the beginning. He came by and watched with a kind of professional curiosity, face intent. By the time we finished, he sat in the chair for a long time with his hands on his knees. "You need to move," he said finally, and the sentence landed like a verdict. I tried. I called my landlord and told him I needed out. He hemmed and hawed and wanted to raise the rent to cover a transfer. Then he dropped it when he saw my face. He offered to let me out of the lease early if I cleaned the carpets and left the keys. Moving was a kind of small public performance. I boxed up my cheap dishes and books, carted them down 3 flights of stairs that suddenly had different names in my head. Retreat, Exodus. I drove away with the windows of my truck open for once, wanting the wind to slice across my face until it hurt. I told myself I was done with it, done with the 3rd floor, and its painter's hands and the way the man had watched me like he was, counting my breaths. The new place was a single-level house without high windows, without reflective panes that could be climbed. For a while I slept. For a while the nights went by like normal things. No scratches. No laughter in the dark. No cold palms pressing glass. I told myself I'd washed the thing from my life. That complacency was brittle. 6 months later I would wake in the night, sweaty and certain. I heard the rustle of nails at a pane not in my apartment but in a shop window downtown. My reflection in the glass of a passing car would show an afterimage, a thin smear where a hand had been pressed. Once, at a friend's barbecue. I left the group for a moment and stood staring out the kitchen window. For a split second, the streetlight caught someone's silhouette climbing the adjacent building like a fly in slow motion. I turned and no one was there. The final image that chased me wasn't a sighting in Lubbock. It was a phone call. On a grey Thursday afternoon. My friend who'd watched the tape called with a voice like someone deflating. He told me he'd been on his roof, fixing shingles in the heat, when he'd lost his balance. He said he'd felt the hitch of his foot and then the sudden cold of the world moving in jerks. He grabbed for the pipe and knew he'd miss. He braced and something with too many jointed hands, wrapped around the outside of the window above him and held him, coiling around the sill like a spider. He said it had felt like being touched by the edge of glass. He said those hands had left prints and then the shape had vanished. He said he climbed down and watched it climb the face of the building, spidering across brick and mortar as if the earth had been a ladder. After that there were more calls. A boy in the next town reported seeing a man crawl along a church wall at dusk. A delivery driver quit after, reporting a figure that clung to a storefront, and then melted when the lights came up. The sightings multiplied like a rumor given voice. The thing had apparently learned the roots and the surfaces, and the way to be unseen in the day and grotesquely present at night. I used to think the world was a table set with a few options, the rational, the religious, the random. But the man on the 3rd floor told me how small that table was. He showed me how hollow the choices could be, how easily they could be overridden by a determination older than a single life. When I think about him now, sitting somewhere on the wrong side of glass, I feel too human and too defenseless. I picture him still, fingers splayed on panes he never crosses, knees bent like a climber who taught himself to defy falling, head cocked as he watches for a silhouette to match his own. If you live above the ground level, if your window is a black square in the night, if you've ever woken to the vague sound of nails across glass, don't dismiss it as a trick of the wind. Close your curtains. Keep the lamp on. Lock your doors. And if you ever see a body pressed to the outside of your pane with feet where there should be air, do not, for the love of whatever fragile thing you hold dear, go to the window and call to it. The worst part isn't the climbing. It's the waiting. It's the way it watches until you look back and then, slowly, with a patience that tastes like old things, it matches you, not in malice but in a cold, endless hunger to be what you are. Story 8. Reflections in the dark. The first time I noticed it, I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom of my little rental house outside Huntsville, Texas. It was late, sometime after 2 in the morning, and the only light came from the small yellow bulb above the mirror. My eyes were half shut, my brain foggy with exhaustion. That's when I saw it. My reflection blinked a second too late. It was subtle, a fraction of a second, maybe less. But once you notice something like that, you can't unsee it. I stood there with the toothbrush hanging out of my mouth, staring at myself in the mirror, waiting for another mistake. Nothing, just my own tired face staring back. I told myself I was imagining things. Sleep deprivation, stress from work, maybe a trick of the bulb. But the next night, it happened again. I rubbed my face, leaned closer, and that's when I realized something that made the hair on my arms rise. My reflection was smiling. I wasn't. The grin wasn't big, just a slight upturn of the lips, but it was there. A smile without warmth, without humor. It vanished the moment I jerked back, like I dreamed it with my eyes open. That was the beginning. Over the next week, it escalated. My reflection started to feel independent. Small things at first. Its head would tilt when mine didn't. Its lips twitching like it wanted to speak. Then it got bolder. I'd lean over the sink and it wouldn't move at all. Just stood there watching me, eyes flat and hungry. I'd leave the bathroom light on at night because I couldn't bear the thought of passing the mirror in the dark. One night, I woke up to a sound I can still hear if I think about it too hard. A faint tapping. Not at the window, at the mirror. 3 sharp knocks, as if someone on the other side was testing the surface. I got out of bed, heart hammering, and stood in the bathroom doorway. The mirror was dark, the bulb flickering. My reflection stood in the glass, closer than it should have been, its face pressed almost against mine. Only, I hadn't stepped forward. It whispered something. I couldn't hear it, but I saw the lips move. The word looked like "let me." I slammed the light switch off and didn't go back in until morning. From then on, every reflective surface in the house became a threat. Not just the bathroom mirror, the black screen of the TV, the dark window after sunset, even the puddle that formed near the leaky kitchen sink. I'd catch glimpses of myself moving when I was perfectly still, sometimes smiling, sometimes scowling, sometimes mouthing words I didn't want to understand. Sleep became impossible. I taped a sheet over the bathroom mirror, but it didn't help. The reflection spread. At night, I'd see myself standing in the hallway mirror, closer than I was standing, eyes wide, grin too sharp. Once, I saw my reflection reach out and place its hand on the inside of the glass. My body went cold all over. Without thinking, I raised my own hand toward it and felt the faintest pressure, like fingertips pressing back. That was when I realized it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a thing that wanted out. I started avoiding mirrors altogether, shaved with a dull razor in the shower, dressed in the dark. My coworkers started to notice. One of them joked that I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I didn't laugh. Then came the night that broke me. I was half asleep on the couch, the TV turned off, the room lit only by a street lamp bleeding through the blinds. I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, the black screen of the TV was staring back at me. Only my reflection wasn't asleep. It was sitting upright, wide-eyed, mouth stretched into a horrible grin. Then it moved. I swear to God, it crawled forward, pressing its palms against the inside of the glass. Teeth bared like it was about to bite. The screen warped, bending outward, as if the glass wasn't solid anymore. I bolted off the couch and tore the plug from the wall. But when I looked back, the screen was blank. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I packed a bag and drove to a cheap motel off I-45. No mirrors in the room. Just a cracked TV I left unplugged. I slept for the first time in weeks, but even then, I dreamed of it. My reflection standing at the foot of the bed, smiling, whispering, "You can't hide forever." I moved out of the Huntsville house after that, left most of my stuff behind, furniture, dishes, even clothes. I couldn't bring myself to risk taking anything that might hold a reflection. But here's the part that haunts me. It followed me anyway. In my new apartment, miles away, I woke one night to use the bathroom. Half asleep, I didn't think, just flipped the light on. For a split second, I thought everything was normal. My tired face, pale in the harsh light. But then it blinked, just a fraction too late. And it smiled. I keep the mirrors covered now, but it doesn't matter. Any reflection will do. A coffee shop window, a car mirror, even a rain puddle. I see it there, waiting, watching, patient. And sometimes, when I get close enough, I swear I can hear it breathing through the glass.